For decades, network television was built on control. Controlled lighting, controlled sound, controlled sets. If a show needed a city street, it built one indoors and painted it safe. The streets of San Francisco did something different. Not revolutionary, but harder to sustain. It set aside the safer option and committed to filming week after week in a real city that didn't cooperate. San Francisco wasn't a backdrop. It was loud, windy, steep, crowded, and expensive. This isn't a story about secrets or scandals. It's about a production gamble most television shows couldn't afford, and how the streets of San Francisco built an entire series around it. Using production context, contemporary reporting, and the limited documentation that exists, this is a story of how realism collided with the realities of 1970s network television, and what that collision changed. By the early 1970s, American television had become a machine optimized for predictability. Not creativity, not realism, control. Network dramas were designed to run like assembly lines. Scripts were locked early, sets were reused endlessly, lighting grids never changed. Sound was pristine because nothing expected was allowed to exist inside a soundstage. The goal wasn't innovation, it was delivering 26 finished hours on time every year without disruption. That wasn't laziness, it was economics. A weekly network series had no margin for error, so the industry perfected a system where variables were eliminated. By the late 1960s, audiences were being exposed to something television dramas couldn't compete with visually: reality. Television news, documentary filmmaking, and even crime photography were showing cities as noisy, crowded, unpredictable places. Meanwhile, scripted dramas still looked sealed off from the real world. Streets were too clean, cities felt interchangeable, violence felt staged, not consequential. Crime shows, in particular, were starting to strain under this artificiality. You could write dialogue about danger, but when the environment itself felt fake, the stakes collapsed. A chase on a backlot never felt like someone might actually get hurt. The problem wasn't the stories, it was the production model. Everyone in television understood the cost of shooting on location, which is why most shows limited how often they did it. For feature films, uncertainty could be absorbed. For a weekly network series, it threatened the entire schedule. When exteriors were required, they were usually handled in fragments. Establishing shots, plates, or inserts captured separately and stitched together with studio footage. The cast stayed on the stage, the illusion stayed intact. That illusion, however, was wearing thin. By the early 1970s, Quinn Martin had already delivered hit series for multiple networks. His production model was famously disciplined. Scripts were finished early, schedules were tight, nothing ran over. That reputation was precisely why ABC trusted him. But Martin also understood something most networks preferred to ignore. Crime stories live or die on environment. When he gained a guaranteed 2-hour pilot and series order filing a contract dispute with ABC, he suddenly had leverage. And an opportunity. He wanted to do a police drama that didn't feel manufactured. Not stylized grit. Actual place. San Francisco wasn't chosen for convenience. It was chosen because it couldn't be faked. Steep hills, narrow streets, dense neighborhoods, constant motion. It was the exact opposite of a controllable production environment. Which raised a real question at the heart of this series. Could a weekly network drama survive if it gave up control? The defining decision behind the streets of San Francisco was simple, consequential, and expensive. The city would not be a backdrop, it would be the set. This wasn't how most network television shows were made. From the beginning, Quinn Martin wanted the series shot where it actually took place. Ed Hume, who wrote the 2-hour pilot, recalled that Martin was actively looking for a series he could produce outside Los Angeles. San Francisco wasn't a stylistic flourish, it was the point. What made this unusual wasn't that the show used location footage. Plenty of series did that occasionally, but that Streets committed to it as a production identity. During the first season, the production split its workflow. All exterior scenes were filmed on location in San Francisco. Most interiors were shot on soundstages at Warner Brothers in Burbank. When necessary, interiors were filmed in real San Francisco locations. This wasn't window dressing. The cast and crew traveled constantly. Episodes were structured around what could realistically be shot in the city that week. By the second season, the experiment escalated. Writer John Wilder confirmed that once the series was renewed, the decision was made to shoot the show entirely on location. The production rented a warehouse near Telegraph Hill, just blocks from the Embarcadero, which became their operational base. Police sets that had previously existed on the Warner stage were duplicated inside the warehouse. Equipment trucks, grip gear, wardrobe, and camera units were all staged locally. This wasn't cheaper. It was the only way the producers believed the schedule could remain survivable. Shooting on real streets introduced problems television had spent decades avoiding. Sound was the first enemy.
I just don't know. All the leads have been checked out. All dead ends.
If it's at all possible, I just assume you wouldn't talk to these two men directly, gentlemen.
Aircraft noise, traffic, crowds, and wind made clean dialogue difficult. Executive producer Howard Alston recalled placing a soundman on location for an entire day before committing to certain areas, just to see if the ambient noise would be usable. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Lighting was equally unforgiving. Cinematographer Jacques Marquette shot the series on fine-grained film stock with higher ASA ratings to handle low-light conditions. Natural light dictated the schedule, not the other way around. Fast lenses and minimal lighting rigs became essential because the company was often moving through 40 or more setups per day. Mobility mattered more than perfection. The crew used a modified Cinemobile to supply power, transport equipment, and speed up setup and teardown. The goal wasn't elegance, it was survival. The realism wasn't cosmetic, it was physical. Chase scenes were staged on real hills, real streets, real fire escapes. Michael Douglas did his own driving. According to script supervisor Michael Priest, cameras were sometimes mounted directly inside cars, with operators squeezed behind the seats while Douglas drove at speed, hitting marks within inches. Douglas recalled one of his first days shooting near Nob Hill. Losing the light, racing downhill, hitting the crest too fast, and briefly going airborne. There was no stunt double, no controlled ramp, just gravity and luck. This kind of physical risk wasn't unusual on the show, it was built into the production itself. Location shooting didn't just change how the show looked, it changed how it was written. John Wilder and producer Cliff Gould pushed writers to build stories around where they could go, not just where they could stage. Wilder described deliberately avoiding generic chases. Instead of running into alleys or basements, characters went up fire escapes, onto rooftops, through neighborhoods that visually mattered. Each season, Wilder traveled to San Francisco before scripting began and compiled a list of locations he wanted used. Alcatraz, the Marina, Fisherman's Wharf, Union Square. These weren't establishing shots, they were narrative anchors. The city shaped the story, not the other way around. Everything about this approach fought network logic. Location shooting slowed production. It increased cost. It exposed the schedule to weather, public interference, and equipment failures hundreds of miles from studio resources. Howard Alston admitted the show was deficit-financed and expensive to produce, even while maintaining a full 26-episode season schedule. The only way it worked was extreme discipline. Scripts finished early, no rewrites during shooting, and relentless planning. By the second season, the streets of San Francisco had demonstrated that a network drama could operate and remain viable while working largely outside the studio system. But survival didn't mean sustainability. Location shooting imposed a production rhythm that never let up. The company typically worked 5 days on the street and 2 days on the stage, depending on script requirements. Night shoots were common and often scheduled at the end of the week. Every episode required moving people, equipment, vehicles, and cast back and forth between locations, sometimes daily. Howard Alston described the process as efficient on paper, but exhausting in practice. Even when things ran smoothly, and by his account they usually did, the constant travel and physical setup wore down the crew. The only reason the production didn't collapse under its own weight was rigid script control. John Wilder described a system designed to eliminate surprises. Stories approved well in advance, 4-act outlines developed before scripting, scripts finalized weeks ahead of shooting, no rewrites during production unless absolutely unavoidable. Wilder personally edited final drafts, negotiated changes with broadcast standards, adjusted dialogue for Malden and Douglas's voices, and ensured the episode could be shot as written. This was not creative indulgence, it was defensive engineering. As Wilder put it, once the camera started rolling, it became a giant vacuum cleaner sucking money off the desk. Organization wasn't optional, it was a difference between staying on schedule and hemorrhaging tens of thousands of dollars. The production's intensity affected everyone. Cast rehearsed scenes during breaks and between setups to stay ahead. Douglas and Malden often ran lines for future episodes while still shooting the current one. According to Douglas, the pace of the show became known among directors and guest stars. If you weren't prepared, you wouldn't survive the week. Actors worked in public spaces, often repeating takes because of noise or interruptions. Crew members routinely logged long hours moving equipment through active neighborhoods. Even small inefficiencies multiplied quickly. By the end of the first season, the strain was already visible. Cliff Gould became ill and was hospitalized, leaving Wilder scrambling to complete the final 4 episodes. The system worked, but only under constant pressure. The experiment didn't pay off immediately. ABC was disappointed with the show's early ratings, and the schedule was shifted from Saturday to Thursday night in an attempt to stabilize it. At the same time, Michael Douglas began pushing for more to do. Not out of ego, but because the workload was brutal and the system demanded constant forward momentum. These pressures didn't break the show immediately, they accumulated. Michael Douglas's departure cannot be understood as simple career ambition or ego. By his own account, the show demanded near total immersion, 6 days a week, 8 months a year, under conditions that left little margin for physical or creative recovery. At the same time, Douglas was beginning to produce One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest while still starring on the series. He wasn't leaving a comfortable studio job, he was exiting a production model that required total commitment and offered no way to sustain it. When Douglas told Carl Malden he planned to leave, Malden supported him immediately. Quinn Martin released Douglas from his contract and allowed him to return for a 2-hour episode to launch the 5th season, a professional courtesy that acknowledged what Douglas had given the show. His exit wasn't a failure of the experiment, it was evidence of its limits. Despite its success, most network dramas did not immediately adopt this model. The reason was simple. Very few productions could sustain this level of effort. The show worked because scripts were locked early, performers were disciplined, the crew accepted extreme conditions, the producer tolerated constant logistical risk. That combination was rare. The Streets of San Francisco proved location-based realism was possible, but it also proved it was expensive, exhausting, and fragile. The industry would adopt its grammar slowly, waiting for technology to make the burden lighter. And that delay is part of why the show's influence would be felt long after its final episode. The Streets of San Francisco didn't just succeed as a series, it subtly shifted expectations about what television drama could look like, even if the industry wasn't ready to fully follow its lead yet. The show's most lasting legacy wasn't its characters or even its ratings. It was the production grammar it normalized. By placing the city at the center of the storytelling, not as decoration, but as a functional, narrative environment, the series demonstrated that realism could coexist with weekly network schedules. Streets, rooftops, stairwells, these weren't obstacles to be hidden, they became story tools. Later shows didn't copy streets episode for episode. What they copied was the assumption that location mattered, that movement through real space created tension, and that authenticity carried dramatic weight. Modern television didn't invent realism, it inherited the permission to pursue it, once technology made that realism sustainable. That idea didn't disappear when the show ended. It went dormant, waiting for technology to catch up. Shows like Hawaii Five-0 were designed from the ground up to operate on location, whereas Naked City, Route 66, and The Fugitive used location shooting to add realism, but they still relied on studio interiors to keep production controllable. The Streets of San Francisco applied that same level of location dependence to a production model originally built around studio control. In the 1970s, realism required brute force, heavy crews, long days, rigid scripts, and constant risk. By the late 1980s and 1990s, lighter cameras, faster film stock, improved sound recording, and digital post-production reduced those barriers. What had once required extraordinary discipline became merely difficult. Modern television didn't invent realism, it inherited the permission to pursue it. Many contemporary crime dramas that treat a city as a character rather than a backdrop operate on assumptions Streets helped legitimize decades earlier. What changed wasn't the idea of realism, it was the cost of achieving it. Prestige no longer meant polish alone. It meant texture, imperfection, environmental noise, moral ambiguity, human behavior unfolding in uncontrolled spaces. John Wilder's emphasis on character-driven stories, human villains, flawed victims, detectives acting more like social workers than archetypes, reinforced this shift. The realism wasn't just visual, it was ethical. That combination will become foundational to later dramatic television, even if Streets itself rarely gets named as a source. Ironically, the very things that made the Streets of San Francisco influential also made it easy to overlook. It didn't rely on gimmicks, it didn't push stylization, it didn't announce itself as revolutionary, it simply did the work, week after week. As a result, its innovations blended into the background of television history, absorbed so completely that they stopped being visible as innovations at all. The true legacy of the Streets in San Francisco is not that it broke the studio system overnight. It's that it proved the studio system wasn't inevitable. It showed that realism could survive network pressure, that discipline could replace control, and that audiences would respond to authenticity even when it was messy, loud, and difficult. After the Streets of San Francisco, the rule didn't disappear, it just stopped being enforceable.